All right, folks, good evening. Thanks for coming in. My name is Michael Watson. I lead the Reactor program here in the Asia Pacific. Tonight we have Will Valita, who's going to deliver a talk for us. Will is a lead platform engineer at the Mantle Group, a former colleague of mine at Microsoft, a really good bloke, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. He's a speaker on the world tour with NDC and other things, but we've got him for about an hour to do a bit of a talk, make it interactive. If you've got some questions, use this time wisely. And at the end, if you've missed anything, it will be recorded. We are live streaming it. And so you can look on the Reactor YouTube page for the video if you've missed something. With that, I will hand over to Will. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Michael. Good evening, everyone. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Will Valita. I'm a lead platform engineer at Mantle Group. I'm usually based in Melbourne, but I do come to Sydney every so often. I almost moved to Sydney, but it's a little bit too expensive for me. Prior to moving to Melbourne, I lived in New Zealand for 13 years, but I'm not from New Zealand. I am from a country called the United Kingdom, specifically from Southampton, which is in the south, near the south coast of England. We're closer to Paris than we are Newcastle. And before you ask, yes, I am very happy. Also relieved. I was flying here this morning when England were playing, and we scored just before I boarded the flight. So I had a very pleasant flight. But I'm not here to talk about football. We're here to talk about Azure Deployment Environments. Who's heard of Azure Deployment Environments? A little bit, one or two hands. Okay, cool, awesome. And then just to kind of gauge people in the room, I know people are online as well. What are your day-to-days? Who would really identify them as a platform engineer? I know you do. I've got one of my colleagues in the room. Also, the camera for the live stream is there. So if I stare at that camera, I'm not wandering into space. I'm just making sure that the camera gets some attention too. How about cloud ops engineers, software engineers, data scientists? I know you and I were having a conversation earlier. Okay, cool. Essentially, what Azure Deployment Environments are, it's one of Microsoft's services to attempt to make infrastructure deployments simpler, more secure, with best practices enforced for our organization. So I will just introduce myself a little bit more. This has now stopped working, which is interesting. So my background, I'm currently a lead platform engineer at Mantle Group. I have had experience as a software engineer, mainly working with .NET. I've worked for banks. I've worked in New Zealand. It's very difficult to avoid the agricultural sector. Writing code for farmers was very interesting and a lot of fun too. I've also worked in health and insurance industries and also retail industries as well. Like Michael said, I was a former Microsoft employee working in the Fast Track for Azure team. I've also been a Microsoft MVP as well. So I've done a bit of conference speaking. I write some blogs. I do some YouTube videos. I don't recommend you check them out. They're not great, but it's out there on the internet. And I used to play rugby as well, but very badly. I'm grateful that I gave it up at 20 so I can do proper things like software engineering. So today what I'll talk about is a little bit of the current issues with provisioning app infrastructure and how that a current way of thinking, and depending on the environment that you work with, how that will affect not only just the software development lifecycle, but also developer experience as well. Then I'll introduce what Azure Deployment Environments are, and I'll talk about the key concept as well. So it doesn't matter if you haven't heard about it before. This is just going to be a real 101, break down the key concepts, and then I'll go into the Azure portal, we'll do a bit of a tour, and I'll show you how you can actually provision infrastructure using Azure Deployment Environments and why we might want to do that. I've put Q&A at the end. I have got an eye on the chat there as well. So if you're online, do ask questions as well. And in the room, stick your hand up and I'll address your questions as we go along. Excuse me. I'm also battling a little bit of a cough. The past month has been very interesting being winter. So good thing there's space between all of us so I don't, I'm not infectious, I've had to reassure that to lots of people. But, if I cough during this, I do apologize. So when we're developing applications, testing is critically important, as well as the ability to test early. When there are failures in our application, there's quite a high cost to it. Here's some stats. This is a slide that I've taken from a build presentation on Azure Deployment Environments because I think it's very critical to the problem that we're trying to solve. Errors cost upwards in US companies around $2 trillion annually. I don't have that on me, and that's a lot of money. And we also spend a lot of time trying to debug problems in our software. And I think as software engineers, we appreciate the issues that we face locally on our local workstations and the issues that we face in remote environments such as Azure can be a little different. The old joke, it works on my machine, is kind of old and stale, but it still applies. Depending on your environment, you can have situations where everything is fine in your own workstations. But when it comes to deploying our applications to Azure, we can encounter issues that we might not have thought of, and catching these early is critical to ensure that our applications are going to be working as we expect it. So this is where the whole idea of kind of shifting testing left. So we introduce tests within our CI/CD pipelines. Maybe we do integration tests where we deploy our applications to say if we've got an application that's deployed to function apps or container apps, maybe we're integrating with the Cosmos DB database, maybe we're integrating with Key Vault. We run some integration tests as part of that in a low-end environment, such as a dev environment or an integration environment, UAT, whatever you want to call it. This is really critical to be able to actually do that. And so the need to provision infrastructure has to be a lot more straightforward. However, the current processes of getting app infrastructure deployed can be a little complex. Who has worked in a really highly regulated environment just in the room? So I'm thinking banking, military as well is an interesting one. Health insurance is one that I've encountered in the past. It's in that banking environment, like how easy is it for you to kind of just, I'll just spin up something in the cloud and just do some testing? Is that dozen teams, massive support requests, like ticket trails, like that kind of thing? Fantastic. You and I should have a chat later about all of that. But it's true. Like, and these things, we can make jokes about it, but these things are implemented for a reason. We don't exist in a vacuum as software engineers and as cloud engineers. We operate in the environment that we're developing in. So this is governance, this means regulations, security, all of this comes into effect when we're developing our applications because we want to make sure our software is secure and we don't put our data and our users at risk. So when you're thinking when you're developing your applications, you might need to, so you'll start out thinking, okay, well, how can I actually spin up some test resources? Then, like we said earlier, who do we need to raise a support request to? How do we raise tickets to actually request a new environment? Then we've got to provide details. So already we're talking to someone who lacks the context or lacks the understanding of what we're actually trying to build, and communicating that isn't always easy. We've got to spend time clarifying our requirements with platform engineers, cloud ops engineers, whoever it is who has the keys to the kingdom to actually provision the resources for us. And this is time wasted. You can go back and forth. They've got other priorities as well. I've worked with clients, I've worked in teams where we have the DevOps engineer hat, but we have 20 tickets we've all got to action from 20 different teams. There's only so many hours in the day. We're going to lose context, and we're going to lose that understanding that we're trying to get when trying to provision an environment. Then we've got to wait for admins to sign off on it. We've got to let them create and configure the infrastructure. And it might not work. It might not be what we wanted. We might have spent all that time talking to them about it, but they just don't understand how they just misunderstood us. So we've got to go back and repeat that cycle of trying to clarify what we're actually deploying until we finally get a test environment where we can actually deploy our applications and work with some resources. So our end state is to really try and step away from that current process and deliver a positive experience and kind of accelerate developer productivity. So when we look at Azure Deployment Environments, it provides a new way of actually provisioning our app infrastructure, and it actually empowers our developers to go and do their best work by building in guardrails and enterprise trust ahead of time, rather than having to manually do it ourselves. So let's take a look at Azure deployment environments. Essentially, at the crux of it, Azure deployment environments help development teams to quickly and easily spin up app infrastructure using project-based templates that establish consistency, best practices, while maximizing security. We get an on-demand access to secure environments, which help us accelerate the different stages of software development in a compliant and cost-effective way. There's an idea of a deployment environment, and this is a collection of Azure resources that we'll define in templates called environment definitions. Essentially, what developers will do is they'll deploy that infrastructure that's defined in the templates in subscriptions where they have access, and then they can use that infrastructure to build their applications on top of. Platform engineers will essentially create and manage these environment definitions. So to help specify which environment definitions are available to developers, platform engineers can associate environment definitions with projects and then assign permissions to developers accordingly. They can also apply governance based on the type of environment. So if you're working with sandbox environment, testing environments, or production environments, you can apply different configurations and different settings to different environments, and then make that available to your developers. So what this diagram kind of demonstrates is an overall capability of what deployment environments can do. So your platform engineers can define your infrastructure templates and then configure the subscriptions, identities, and permissions needed to deploy to those different environments. And then developers will essentially create environments based on the templates and build their applications and supporting infrastructure. Cool. Now, when will we actually use this? So let's think about two personas, platform engineers and developers. So starting off with platform engineers, the kind of scenarios that Azure Deployment Environments helps platform engineers with is they help apply the right set of policies and settings on various different types of environment. As you can imagine, your dev environments, you want your bare bone resources just to get things going, just to test something out quickly. But when you move to production, you need to have stricter controls in place. Maybe you need more resources, higher SKUs. This is the type of thing that platform engineers can configure when using Azure Deployment Environments. They can provide project-based curated sets of IAC infrastructure as code templates. They can define specific Azure deployment configurations per project and per environment type. And they can provide a self-service experience without giving over control over subscriptions. So one of the things that deployment environments can do is they can have managed identities to assume the permissions needed to deploy resources. So rather than giving you an owner role over a subscription or you a contributor role, I delegate that responsibility to Azure Deployment Environments. And then the roles that Deployment Environments provides is that developers can go in and actually create environments, or they could administer a dev center. And I'll show how that works a little bit later in the demo. Now, for our developers, this makes life a little easier for them because then they can go and create environments whenever they need them and then develop their applications on top of that infrastructure. They can use deployment environments to deploy pre-configured environments for any stage of the development lifecycle. They can spin up a sandbox environment to explore Azure, and they can actually create and manage environments through the developer portal, which I'll show you later, also with the Azure CLI and Azure Developer CLI. Who here uses the Azure Developer CLI, just out of interest? No hands. Okay, never mind. That's good. Awesome. And this provides us with a few benefits. So this enables standardization and collaboration. So rather than having to rebuild infrastructure as code templates for each project each time, you might have a standardized way that you want to implement a certain service in Azure across your organization. So you're able to do that using deployment environments and do that in a way that allows people to create those environments on demand. Compliance and governance. So your platform engineering teams can curate your environment definitions to enforce those enterprise security policies, and then they can map the projects that you're working on to subscriptions, identities, and permissions based on the environment that you're working in. we're a little quick. Project-based configuration, so you can organize your environment definitions based on the type of application that development teams are working on, rather than just having an unorganized list of templates or traditional infrastructure as code setup. You can enable self-serve capabilities as well, so your development teams can actually go into the portal, create and easily create app infrastructure resources by using pre-configured templates, and you can also track costs with these resources to stay within your budget. And there's also integration with your existing tool set. So we'll talk a little bit about catalogs and how you can use repositories in GitHub and Azure DevOps to store your templates. But essentially, Azure Deployment Environments is designed to work with your existing tool set. So it's not like you have to use a new or implement a new tool just to get this working. Cool. So let's dive into some of the key concepts of Azure Deployment Environments, and then I'll jump into a demo to actually show how it all works. So this is a big old diagram that I have stolen from the Azure documentation. So here, who here's worked with Microsoft DevBox? Okay, no one in the room. That's okay, that's fine. Essentially, Microsoft DevBox and Azure Deployment Environments share something called a Dev Center. Within your Dev Center, you have environment types, projects, also environment types for specific projects as well. And then users of your Azure Deployment Environments will spin up environments based on infrastructure as code templates that are stored in something called catalogs. And then you have environment definitions, which kind of expose those catalogs, and you can configure how your users can deploy those catalogs. So let's jump into it a little bit. So a Dev Center is a collection of projects that require similar settings. And these Dev Centers enable your platform engineers to use catalogs to manage infrastructure as code templates that are available to projects, and also configure environment types, which essentially configure the types of environments that can be created. Then your projects, this will represent a team or a business function within your organization. So say if you're working on a particular you're working on the ordering service, or maybe you belong to a domain, a cloud domain, data domain within a consultancy, for example, you will have a project that's assigned to you, and then your projects can be associated with your overall organization's Dev Center. The purpose of this, platform engineers will configure environments for a project by specifying which environment types are needed for a developer team. Then underneath that is your environments. So your environments are essentially a collection of Azure resources on which your application will be deployed. And this is made up of your infrastructure as code templates, so your Bicep templates, Terraform templates, and Pulumi. Does anyone use Pulumi here? No one ever answers yes. It's there if you want to use it. You know, go nuts. I mean, who here uses Terraform? Just a couple of hands up, and then Bicep. One person, and me as well, but that's okay, cool. But there's support for Bicep, Terraform, and Pulumi templates as well. And this might contain container apps, functions that talk to Cosmos DB, talk to Key Vault for secrets. That can consist of PaaS and infrastructures and IaaS services, and essentially you deploy those resources as part of an environment. And I'll show you how that works in the demo. Now, to talk a little bit about identities. So essentially in Azure Deployment Environments, you use managed identities to provide those elevation of privileges. So rather than assigning roles to specific developers or specific groups in Microsoft Entra, you use managed identities of Azure Deployment Environments, and then you grant the role to the Azure Deployment Environments to be able to deploy those infrastructure resources, such as owner or contributor. The Dev Center or project will then have a managed identity that will be granted access to also connect to catalogs and also perform deployments. And there are 3 built-in roles. So you can have your administrators who will be your platform engineers. They'll be able to create environments and manage environment types for a project. You have your users, so they'll be able to, this will be your developers. They'll go into the developer portal and be able to create environments based on their access. And then you could also just have read access as well. So if you just want people to be able to view the environments that other users are created, maybe you have finance teams or security teams, they just want that access to view what's being created, you're able to do that. Cool, so let's talk about the differences between dev center environment types and project types. So for your dev center types, environment types, sorry, you can define different environment types that your developer teams can use. So this could be dev, UAT, prod, non-production, production, whatever you want to call it. You can map the same environments that you use throughout your organization and then configure the settings based on the various environment types, based on what your development team needs. Now, your project environment types are just a subset of these types that you configure for the dev center. And this helps pre-configure the types of environments that specific developer teams can create. And then you can configure your target subscription in Azure, which resources are created per project and per environment type. So say if you've got a project that decides all of a sudden, oh, we're going to introduce a performance environment, you can create a project environment type purely for a performance environment and configure templates on that purely on the project needs. Now, catalogs. Catalogs are essentially a pretty cool name for a curated set of infrastructure as code templates that your development teams use to create environments. These can be specific to projects or available to your entire dev center. And you can attach catalogs from Azure DevOps and GitHub repositories. And you can basically add new templates to your GitHub repositories or your Azure DevOps, or Azure repos, sorry. And you can configure syncs. So essentially what deployment environments will do is they'll look at that repository and maybe on a schedule or every time you push a new template in your repository, it will sync with it and make sure that those templates are available for your developers to provision through the developer portal. And this is associated with an environment definition. So this is a combination of an infrastructure as code template, your Bicep, your Terraform, Pulumi, whatever, and an environment manifest file. What this manifest file does, it defines the environment and provides metadata about your template. And your dev team will then use this to create the environments in Azure. So what you can do is define a full-blown Bicep file, but only make a couple of parameters available through the environment variable. Say, for example, if you're creating a container app, you just want your developers to specify an image name, and that's all they're able to configure. You can do that through environment definitions, which is pretty powerful. Cool. So that was quick kind of quick flow through the key concepts of Azure Deployment Environments. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to actually start to work with this, and I'll show you how you can provision resources through the developer portal. Awesome. So what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to get rid of my taskbar. That's annoying me. Hide that. Hopefully that works. Awesome. Fantastic. Cool. So here I am in the Azure portal, and this is my Dev Center if I get rid of notifications. Now, Dev Center has the ability to kind of control two resources. So Microsoft DevBox and also Azure Deployment Environments. But we'll focus on Azure Deployment Environments for now. So in this Dev Center will have an identity. And I start with this because one of the cool things about Azure Deployment Environments is rather than granting specific developers or specific teams permissions, such as owner or contributor roles to enable them to go and deploy resources, we can delegate that responsibility to our Dev Center. So if I go into my roles, I should see, if I look at my role assignments, I can see some resources as well as users. The permission of owner over specific applications and also environment types, which I'll show a little bit later. But essentially, imagine if you're working in your organization and all of these users weren't there. we have the ability for our users, for our Azure deployment environment to go and create resources on our behalf. So now if I go into my environment types, this will be my environment types that I've configured at the dev center entirely. So here I've got non-production and production. But essentially what I can do with these environment types, I can define different environment types based on what my development teams will actually go ahead and deploy to. So if I go ahead and create a new environment, I'll just call this sandbox. And I'll just add tags, so all of the principles apply for good governance. So I go ahead, add that now. I now have this sandbox environment, so I can provision resources that are configured to use which I can deploy in my sandbox. Now, in Azure Deployment Environments, projects essentially represent teams or business functions within your organization. So a good example of that is you might want to create a project to implement e-commerce applications. If you're split by domains, you might want to create a project for your specific domain, like a cloud domain. And then within that, you might have a development, staging, and production environment for that particular project. Now, when you associate a project with the Dev Center, all of the settings for your Dev Center are automatically applied to the project. And then each project can only be assigned with one Dev Center. So what I've got, if I just go into projects, here I've got one already, but I'm going to create a new one. So I'm going to assign that to my Dev Center that I've created. I'm just going to call this e-commerce. And I can also give it a subscription. There we go. We can do things with DevBox if we wanted to, but I'm not doing that for this one. And we can also assign project level catalogs to it. So for catalogs that are attached to a particular dev project, permissions are determined which catalogs items are imported to the project on sync. So I can go ahead and include deployment environment definitions. Go ahead and create that. Hopefully that won't take too long. But what should happen in the background, if I go back into my Dev Center, go into projects, eventually we should see that new project being created. I don't know why I opened the Cloud Shell. I'll just close that. But I've got one open, so I'll let Azure do its thing. Oh, there we go. It was created. So if I refresh, I should see, boom, there's my e-commerce application project, sorry. Now what I can do is I can then go ahead and create project environment types. Remember that project environment types are a subset of the environment types that you configure for the Dev Center. And this helps you pre-configure the types of environment that are specific to that development team. So that Mantle project team might have a non-production and a production environment. But for that e-commerce team, it might have a dev environment, a UAT environment, production environment. So what I can do is I can actually go into my e-commerce application, e-commerce project, sorry. And what I can do then is then go into environment types. And these are specific to the environment types for this particular project. So if I add a new environment type, I can use these environment types from my Dev Center that I've configured. And then I can assign creator roles. So I can assign owner or contributor role. I can use system assigned managed identities for the deployment, or I can use a user assigned identity as before. Go ahead and add that. Now, one thing you would have noticed, you have to assign at least one identity to your project because essentially that identity is used to perform the environment deployment on behalf of developers. So again, you can use a system assigned identity or a user assigned identity. Now, before developers can go ahead and create environments based on environment types in a project, we have to provide access to them. And this is done through role assignments at the level of the project. So essentially, the role that we're looking for is the deployment environments user role, and that will help enable our users to create, manage, and delete their own environments. Now, you also need to have sufficient permissions on the project before you can add users to it. So last time I tested this, because I'm the owner in the subscription, it was kind of redundant. I was like giving myself another role for the sake of a role, but let's hope I can actually do it properly here. So in my project, if I go into access control, and if I add a new role assignment, the role that we're looking for, like I mentioned earlier, is deployment environments user. And this will provide access to manage my environment resources within that project. So I'm going to go ahead and search for myself. There I am. Fantastic. And then I'm going to go ahead, review, and assign. Cool. So now I have that role assignment on that particular project. So if I go down into deployment environment users, there I am. There I go. Cool. So that's kind of the configuring and setting up everything for your Azure deployment environments, which is a little mundane, but now we'll get into the interesting thing. So there's a developer portal, which I've been signed out of. That's okay, because I've got the link here, which I can use to essentially manage all of my resources and environments. So if I'm going to go ahead and just sign in to my work email, essentially the developer portal is a very simple landing page that allows me to create my application infrastructure and also my DevBox resources. So I have got one which I've created earlier, which I'll show you what it looks like in the end. But what I've got is I've got this, I've got a couple of catalogs that have been configured to my dev center. And essentially, when we add a new catalog, like I mentioned earlier, these could be repositories that are stored either on Azure DevOps or GitHub, where we can store our infrastructure as code templates and then have that as our central repository to be able to deploy application infrastructure through our developer portal. So I'll go into GitHub and I'll show you what I might do. Just out of that, minimize that a little bit. Okay, cool. So this repository, my Dev Center catalog, essentially contains environment templates that define Azure infrastructure. So this one is a very basic bicep file that will deploy a container app environment, and also a log analytics workspace. So for those of you who are familiar with bicep, it looks like a bicep file. Awesome, fantastic, very simple bicep file here. This is accompanied with a environment manifest file. So I'll open up that YAML page. So essentially, this is the metadata that I'm using to expose this infrastructure as code template to my developers. So here, this template path is pointing to my main.bicep file. I've got a summary. This is just a deployment of an Azure container app using bicep. And then I've got a couple of parameters. So I've got parameters for CPU core, for memory, and also some allowed values, and also a container image as well, along with a default value. So if I go into the developer portal, I can click on new, a new environment. So this new environment, I'm just going to go reactor test. And then for the project, I'm going to use the Mantle project that I had earlier. I'm going to select an environment type. So this is going to be non-production. And then I've got environment definitions. So I've got a few here. So all of these environment definitions are made available in these catalogs here, which are all linked to GitHub repositories. So Microsoft have provided kind of like a quick start catalog just to get you up and running. But I've got one from my Mantle Dev Center catalog. So if I go back into the portal, the environment definition I'm going to look for is that container app, which is in that Mantle Dev catalog. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And one of the cool things that we can do with this, if we just want to provision application infrastructure and we're just doing testing on that for a day, we can actually set an expiration date and time for that infrastructure. So what I can do, today's the 11th and the time is currently 6:36. So if I want to delete that at, let's be really ambitious, 6:45. Hopefully I can beat it. Cool. So after that time, we should have our resources automatically cleaned up for us, which is great for kind of governance and making sure we're not spending money when we don't need to. So here are the parameters for my container app. This matches the manifest file that I've defined in my YAML file here. So I need to provide a location, container image. You can provide default values as well. And then also the amount of CPU and memory size. So I will deploy it in beautiful Sydney. And then for the number of CPU cores, just 0.5. I've got a default value of 1. I'm going to go ahead and create that. And underneath the hood, what that's going to do, my Azure Deployment Environments has the necessary permissions to go ahead and deploy that infrastructure. So as a developer, I haven't had the need to clone any repositories or clone any infrastructure as code templates onto my local machine. I haven't had to push it through a deployment pipeline. If I'm just building a little sandbox environment for myself, I've come to a portal and I've kind of use the UI to self-service my own application infrastructure. So while that's creating and hopefully beats the expiration time of 6:45, I can actually view the resources that I've deployed. Here's one I made earlier by clicking on those environment resources. So if I go into the Azure portal, I can see that those resources have been created. So I've got my application container app, I've got my container app environment, and also a log analytics workspace. So everything that's defined in this main.bicep file, that's been deployed to this resource group. So this Mantle project test app 01. This is the naming convention. So you'll have the name of your project along with the environment name that you specify. It's created a resource group along with all that underlying infrastructure. So that's still creating. If I wanted to go ahead and update this, I can redeploy it. And then if I wanted to provide more CPU and memory, I can just go ahead and do that, redeploy, and that will go ahead and redeploy the resources for me. I can also set expiration type, date and time on that. So if I wanted to clean up that environment later, I can go ahead and do that after the fact as well. Cool. So now if I go back into that, give that a refresh. That may take some time, which is okay. I'll make sure that I haven't missed anything out in my demo. Having a look at these quick starts. These just show the quick starts that are available to you from Microsoft. I think, yeah, they've just given Bicep and ARM templates. So you can use this with ARM, Bicep, but there is support for Terraform and Pulumi as well. Give that a refresh. If I go into this container app, if I look into my containers, hopefully that will properties. No, still versioning. I may have bitten off more than I can chew, but that's okay. Go back into the resource, deployments. A minute last time. If I just refresh that, let's see what comes back with. Okay, cool. So just need to refresh the screen. So if I look at my environment resources, so I'm back into Azure, I should see my resources have been deployed. So Mantle project reactor test. So that resource group has been created for me. And I could make everyone sit here for 3 minutes and see if it expires automatically. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just teasing. I'm sorry. I'll have a look at so that's still creating, and that's still going to expire. I'll tell you what, I'll finish the rest of my slides and then we'll come back to it. So if I go back, cool. So essentially the purpose of Azure Deployment Environments, we want to essentially empower our developer teams to deploy application infrastructure without breaking kind of the common sense things that we need them to do. So security, governance, and cost management. There's nothing worse than trying to deploy infrastructure on your local machine only for it to fail because you don't have the right permissions. You might have configured something wrong. And there's also nothing worse than working with a platform engineer trying to throw the problem over the wall, essentially trying to explain the context of your application, what you need to deploy it on, what you actually need for the application to run, only for them to get it wrong because they're burnt out, because they've got 20 different requests and they can't get to you and they don't really understand what you're talking about. And it just goes horribly wrong. So with Azure Deployment Environments, we start with code and automation right from the forefront. We stay right with the governance and security and cost management that's baked into our templates. We manage it in one central location in the catalog, and it provides us with a self-service experience that allow us to provision environments through the portal experience and gives us the confidence that we're deploying infrastructure in a safe and compliant way. Cool. So thanks for listening. The great thing about having a last name like Valida, we were talking about it in the room earlier, that it's slightly Spanish, that I am the only Will Valida in the world, as far as I know. If there is another Will Valida out there, let me know, because he is an imposter. No, I'm joking. But yeah, I've got my own blog. I do lots of stuff on YouTube, or I'm trying to get my YouTube channel grow on that. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do. I'm also on Twitter as well, but yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. And before I wrap up, we're going to go back into, it's expiring in 1 minute. I need a countdown. Oh, okay. Now it's gone. Okay, so if I refresh that again, will that be gone? So this are the resources that we set earlier. Remember, we set an expiry date on it. Maybe it's going to go ahead and delete that underneath the hood. We'll wait and see. Hopefully it does. We'll keep the stream going. I'll keep the demo up and running. But are there any questions in the room? If not, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for giving up your evening for me. Really appreciate you coming out, and to all those online, thank you for joining. Until next time.
Thanks very much, Will. Thanks, everyone. As I mentioned, the recording will be available on YouTube through the Microsoft Reactor. So if you've missed something, please jump on and have a look. But again, thanks, Will, for making the time, coming up from Melbourne to do this for us. We appreciate you coming out. Thanks, everyone.